Ambassador John Bolton, thank you for speaking to India today on your controversial new book, The Room Where It Happened. My first question
Thank you very much for having me.
Is that I was surprised as to why you didn't get into detail on a very important event, a major event that happened in the subcontinent on February 26, 2019, between India and Pakistan. It was the day that India used its Air Force to carry out a strike against militant groups in Pakistan in Balakot. And this was the first time the Indian Air Force had done so since the 1971 war. Pakistan then retaliated the next day, and an Indian pilot chased the Pakistan aircraft, shot it down, an F-16, and of course his aircraft was also shot down, and he was captured and released later. But in your book, this particular episode is only almost like a passing mention. Why is that so?
Well, not because the episode wasn't important to India and to the United States, but as I describe in the book, the Secretary of State, the President, and I were all in Hanoi to meet with Kim Jong-un for the second summit on the North Korean nuclear weapons program. And we were in touch with Acting Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in Washington. I think we spoke with our counterparts in India. And what happened was, as you described, the confrontation ended and without further incident. But I take your point entirely. This was a potentially very significant military confrontation, very risky behavior on the Pakistani side. I thought the government of India displayed great restraint. And I conveyed that, I think, a few days later in a conversation. But this is part, I think, of something that for the United States needs to be much more important, which is expanding and deepening the bilateral U.S.-India relationship. We have many common threats to discuss. We have some issues that need to be resolved between us. But there's no underestimating the importance of a stronger India-U.S. connection for the rest of the century, really.
What was the briefing that you mentioned? There were a lot of phone calls going around. Were you part of those phone calls? And what was the kind of briefing you were given about the incident?
Well, actually, Mike Pompeo and I were together in the office space we had in the hotel in Hanoi where we were staying. On the phone back to Washington, to the Pentagon, making calls both to India and Pakistan, speaking with some of our friends in Europe as well. And it was one of these circumstances. It was late at night, I should say, as well in Hanoi. And we were being filled in as information became available. So certainly our immediate reaction was that this was a potential provocation from the Pakistani side, as we understood it, that could have escalated and that obviously could have been quite serious, both on the subcontinent, but for the world as a whole. Fortunately, it came to a relatively quick end that evening, and then the next morning did not worsen. But it was a developing situation where, not being in Washington, away from our base of communications and almost all of our staff with the president there in Hanoi, it was a matter of some concern and therefore fully deserving our attention, despite the meeting the next day with Kim Jong-un.
Now, you had a conversation with your Indian counterpart, Ajit Doval, 2 days later on February 28th, where much of the action was over. What was the impression you had about the Indian strike? There were, the Indian Air Force went across the border and struck deep inside Pakistan at a militant camp in Balakot. What were the reports you got? Because the Indians reported that they had caused casualties and destroyed the camp. What was the American intelligence saying about that?
Well, I did speak with Mr. Doval a few days later. That was the communication I referred to earlier. I won't get into what the U.S. intelligence revealed to us, of course, But I had a very good conversation. I think Mike Pompeo had a good conversation with his counterpart. And I think we came away from the crisis feeling that the Indian side had exercised appropriate restraint. And it was a real incentive for deepening communication in the event of future crises. These are things that if you're prepared for them, sometimes they can be resolved much more easily than if they come up on you and it catches you by surprise. I don't think there's any doubt of that from our perspective.
Did the Indian Air Force strike the camps, and were there casualties that were reported? What was after all, you were the national security advisor and you would have known what had happened.
Right. Well, as I say, for reasons I'm sure you can understand, I don't want to get into what our intelligence brought to us, because it might reveal the capabilities and sources and methods that we used. We were pleased that the way the crisis played out and the restraint shown on the Indian side, that it was resolved peacefully. And we had similar conversations on the Pakistani side. These things always have different versions depending on what capital city that you're sitting in. But for us, it was something that showed the importance of the enhanced communication with New Delhi in particular, that compared to some of my jobs in earlier administrations, really revealed, I think, how the relationship had changed and had grown stronger.
I was just, again, a bit surprised because you get into vivid detail in all the other episodes that you had to deal with as national security advisor. But in this, your reticence is a bit puzzling. You had revealed very telling details in the other chapters that were there. Why the restraint in this particular case?
Well, I've been restrained, I can assure you, in all cases dealing with anything that came from U.S. intelligence or intelligence from our friends and allies as well. That's just something that can only be revealed with permission. But in terms of the details of the crisis as it unfolded, really it happened relatively quickly. And you'll forgive me as I say, it was late at night in Hanoi, and memory tends to fade after those long visits. We turned immediately the next day for the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, where you'll recall the North Koreans tried and failed to get us to accept a partial deal on their nuclear program. So that was obviously the reason for the trip to Hanoi and our main focus at that point.
Because the next day, Pakistan had a retaliatory strike against India, didn't succeed. And of course, when an Indian pilot chased the Pakistani aircraft, he was shot down. But before that, he shot down an F-16 of the Pakistan Air Force. What is the information you have on that strike that India did?
Well, we were kept informed the next day as we were meeting with Kim Jong-un, going back and forth. Hanoi, not too many time zones away from India and Pakistan. And so we were in relatively real-time contact and hearing what was happening. And our basic priority was to see the crisis winding down. And as I said a moment ago, I do think that India's behavior, and I said this to Mr. Doval a few days later, I thought it was appropriate and proportionate, and should mark an opportunity in an effort to avoid this thing happening again, and with a new government in Pakistan impending, to see if that might provide an opportunity for further discussions bilaterally there as well.
And the F-16 jet, because the U.S. would know about it. Pakistan denies that it lost a jet, but India says it did strike down. What is your information on that?
Well, again, that's something I can't comment on that. And the government of India has given its side of it. The government of Pakistan has given its side, but beyond that, I really can't go.
Did you also talk to the Pakistan side about the incident, and what was your impression when you spoke to them? And did U.S. play a role in calming the situation after that?
Well, obviously there were different perceptions of how the crisis had arisen and different perceptions of how it wound down. I would like to think that that the U.S. was able to play a constructive role. I think the fact that we were interested and involved, at least in communicating with our respective counterparts, even though we were with the president in Hanoi for this very important summit on the North Korean nuclear program, showed how seriously we took any kind of threat to international peace and security on the subcontinent. And that's something I wish there were ways to address it in greater detail. But India has very strong views, historically derived, about how to resolve its differences with Pakistan. That's something we understand across the whole range of disagreements. And to the extent we can be helpful, certainly we'd like to, but we're not trying to get into the middle of it either. It is something that will have to be resolved under the terms of the Simla understanding in direct negotiations between the two sides. And ultimately, to live in peace and security with your neighbor, if the two countries involved haven't gone through the arduous process of negotiating the understanding themselves, nobody else is going to impose it from the outside, that's for sure.
And what was did you brief President Trump about that incident, and what was his reaction if you did talk to him about it?
Well, I think the next morning, both Mike Pompeo and I did speak with him as we were in preparation to meet with Kim Jong-un. I'm sure it won't surprise anybody that his main focus was on that meeting, and he took our assurances that we thought that things looked like they would be under control, and that for the rest of the day we would not be diverted from the summit with Kim Jong-un. But we were fully prepared during that entire period. Had something else developed, we certainly would have turned our attention to it.
You made a curious, you wrote a curious end to this, but when you said, but when two nuclear powers spin up their military capabilities, and I'm reading from your text, it is best not to ignore it. But no one else cared at that time. The point was clear to me. This is what happened when people didn't take nuclear proliferation from the likes of Iran and North Korea seriously. What did you mean by no one else cared? Was it President Trump? Was it the administration? Who was not caring about it?
No, with a few exceptions around the world, it was something that perhaps passed too quickly for them to get concerned about. Kim Jong-un didn't bring it up at all. For example, it didn't come up in those discussions. But to me, it was another demonstration that our concern about the spread of weapons of mass destruction was an important consideration, and a very strong reason to be sure that a rogue state like North Korea didn't get nuclear weapons.
And in general, not speaking about this incident, what was your impression of the way President Trump looked upon relations with India? And are there any incidents that you remember that strike you as something significant in what he said?
Well, I think the president views much of foreign policy through an economic prism, less from a strategic point of view, more from a transactional economic point of view. So, of course, he's always concerned about the tariffs, balance of payments, deficits, and that sort of thing. This came up in discussions with Prime Minister Modi on each time that the two of them got together, sometimes with more difficulty than in others. My own view was that while I do think there were significant tariff trade barrier issues to discuss, I wish we had spent more time with the two leaders together talking about the strategic priorities of the region. And let's be straightforward here, fundamentally, how to deal with China and the challenges and threats that China poses, particularly given the geography that you face with a common border with China, with Pakistan on one side, and two nuclear powers on your border. So I wish that we had more opportunity, as I say, at that summit level to see those discussions. I was very pleased that Prime Minister Modi was always open to suggestions by Prime Minister Abe of Japan, that India and Japan meet, and that we have trilateral meetings, which we did have several of between India, Japan, and the United States. I think that's very important. I think we're all still moving away from the 20th century and the Cold War. We face the common threat of international terrorism, but how to deal with China in the 21st century, I think, is the existential question. So rather than dealing with U.S.-India trade relations, and I don't doubt that those are important issues, I do wish the president had spent more time on the strategic issues.
Hi everyone, Preeti Chaudhary here. Hope you like this video. For latest news and analysis, like and subscribe to the India Today YouTube channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated. Thank you for watching.